a short sort of way to summarize the book is that this is a book about a Chinese family's struggle living in Japan as Chinese immigrants during the 1990s. But the longer version, this is also a book about two sisters coming together, trying to understand, struggling to understand each other through lenses of prejudice, through a huge history divide, and through a big culture divide, and also through family secrets and lies, and how they eventually have to come to terms with each other. But ultimately, this is a book about, is a meditation about the meaning of home. So the book, today's presentation, I am doing it in two parts. It's divided into two parts. The first part, I'll be talking about what's behind writing this novel, and why did it take me 10 years? And I'll talk about the why and how. And then the second part, I'll be talking about my personal journey of finding a home, what home means to me. So, the why. So, I mentioned a minute ago that I grew up in Hong Kong and also in Japan. I spent my, well, I was taken out of China from Qingdao. Qingdao is my hometown. I left China before I was the age of 5 and went to Hong Kong with my parents and a younger brother. And I remember, you know, the early days I was taunted a lot by school friends that they call me, you know, the person from the big continent, which is their way of saying that you're a mainlander, called country bumpkin, you know. So you have to understand, I'll show you a picture here. You have to understand that China in the 60s was like this. So there's a huge economic gap between China and Hong Kong. And from that, and then I went from Hong Kong to Japan because there's a link. My father, this goes back to the history a little bit. My father had to learn Japanese because he's from the Liaodong Peninsula, is up northeast. That's part of the Manchuria, Manchukuo, if you will. And he was forced to study Japanese. So early on, there was a link, you know, between my family and Japan. And so that early Hong Kong experience, plus my experience in Japan, sort of gave me the idea of wanting to write a book someday about my experience of living as an outsider. The Japan experience is especially critical in the sense that I think that experience of you know, feeling like an outsider is even more intense because not because Japan is necessarily more discriminatory than other countries, but more because Japan is a homogeneous society. There's a lot of emphasis on insider, outsider. There's a lot of emphasis on hierarchy. And you combine that with the fact that, you know, in the hierarchical society, the Japanese have a way of putting themselves like at the top, and then the Caucasians in the middle, and then if you're Asian, and then if you happen to be women, ooh, 2 strikes against you. So that's really intensified my experience of feeling like an outsider. I really, you know, I felt like I didn't belong. So that sort of planted a seed in my head early on. But the real catalyst to me wanting to write a book is when my sister, after 30 years of separation, decided to join the family in Tokyo. And that was in the 1990s. So let me back up a little bit about the history. my sister was raised separately from me, because, from my younger brother and me, because there was a strict Hong Kong immigration law that says that each family from China can only bring up to 2 children. And that is because there were a lot of refugees coming from Hong Kong, coming from China to Hong Kong to escape the Great Famines. China went through a very dire period where, because of the 2 famines after the Great Leap Forward, the failed political campaign, he left a lot of millions of people were starved to death. And my father trying to help the family escape the famines was what got him started to move the family from China to Hong Kong. But because of this strict immigration law, my sister, being the oldest, was left to stay in China. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. The idea, my parents' idea at the time was that it would only be arrangement for a couple of years. They were thinking that once we get our permanent residency, then we'll go back and retrieve their oldest daughter. But of course, the Cultural Revolution broke out. It started in 1966, and that sort of threw off my parents' plan. And so during that period, the Cultural Revolution, which started even before 1966, I would say, started in 1965. Things were already changing, and it lasted until 1976. Now, China started opening up, but it was not like they opened right away overnight. So that opening process took a little while. So meanwhile, we have no communication with my sister during the whole period of the Cultural Revolution. So it was only at the beginning of the 80s that that we were able to travel back to China to visit my sister. And I think that the whole time we didn't realize that she was desperately trying to get out as well. By then, she was already married, and she's a mother. And maybe my mother assumed that, okay, we have our path. Unfortunately, for my sister, it's different paths, and maybe that's okay. It happens to other people, and we didn't really think anything will come out of the subsequent meetings after we went to visit her. But she did something very drastic. She left her family. She essentially abandoned her family. She was desperate. Chinese were very desperate in those days. So she decided she announced that she's coming, and then of course we started making arrangements for her to come. But meanwhile, she harbored so much of this thinking that we were rich overseas Chinese, and that she wanted to claim her place in the family. Very unfortunate for my sister. By then, we are essentially a dysfunctional family because my parents, through history or whatever, during this whole time of moving from Hong Kong to Japan, my parents had to live separately for a long time because it was a very difficult process to make that jump from Hong Kong to Japan. So they grew apart in this 8 years of living apart, and so essentially, even though they didn't have a divorce, they were living separately. They might as well be divorced. So unfortunately for my sister, when she came to be with the family, she was sorely disappointed. She was so devastated. But this whole struggle, meanwhile, this two-sister dynamic was going on because, I'm the younger sister. The younger sister, maybe I should reverse it. The younger sister is sort of like a fictional avatar, if you will, in the book. But there's a lot of culture divide, a lot of historical divide, and it's this situation, very difficult situation of a dysfunctional family trying to come to terms with its past, trying to come to terms of bringing the two cultures, big divide, together, and meanwhile every single family member is struggling to find his or her place in the adopted land of Japan is what eventually brought me to writing the book, and thought